thing with compliance score is that everybody goes into analysis paralysis when it comes to this number. Everybody tries to get it up to the highest value that they can. In some aspects, in some organizations, it's actually a detrimental effect. So you actually end up reducing the collaboration that you have if you just concentrate on turning all of these on. What I would always suggest is take a look and figure out what it is that you want from an organization when it comes to compliance. Don't enable stuff that you don't need. Only enable the stuff that you do need. Therefore, you will have a healthy, secure compliance score, not one that actually gives you less to work from. When we come through Compliance Manager then, within here, you have a list of all of the improvement actions that your environment can take to boost that score up, okay? Let's give it a second to load. What I have in here is a number of categories or assessments that I've added in for my own purpose, okay? Now, it would purely depend on your environment, which ones you would need. The data protection baseline is the one that is there by default, but as I'll show you in a moment, you can go through and choose other regulatory alignments like FINRA, 617A, GDPR, POPIA, CCPIA, whatever the case may be. These improvement actions here actually give you a breakdown of what you would need to do to configure that improvement action. And it will also give you the valuation or the percentage of the score that it gives you once you've done that particular item or that action. When you come into the actual improvement action itself, you have an overview on the left-hand side, and you have some details around what it is. More importantly, you have an assign action task. So I can click on this, and I can assign this to an individual or group within my environment to say, you look after this side of the business. Here, I'm going to assign this to you. They can then follow up on those actions and configure those items. Additionally, you have on the right-hand side here, the implementation stage, the testing, the standards and regulations, and any documentation. So if I wanted to go into the edit implementation details, it would take me through here. If I'd made this live, I'd have had the opportunity to add some implementation notes within here. This is good for lots of organizations that have a global footprint. So you may have a compliance team that's spread from one continent to another. If you're doing that follow the clock, follow the sun scenario, at least you can come in here and you can say to somebody, I've tried to do this, or we've implemented this. We've gotten so far, now we're in testing and so on and so forth. So this is a great place to add some notes in. Here is where you would add your testing notes in, and then your testing data based on the same criteria. Here you have your standards and regulations. So what are those standards and regulations map back to? And you have your control ID here. And you have a bit more information about what the regulation is under. Then you have documents as well. Now, I see this being used quite a lot from larger organizations that are bound by many regulators, okay, many regulations. So they would come in here, they would add in maybe a compliance design or a configuration build or secure build document, which maps back to this particular configuration or the actual regulation that it's under itself. All you would need to do is build out that document, come here, click attach, and just add it into here. Anybody else then, like I say, from that worldwide view, they'd have visibility into what you've done within that team the previous day or previous weekend or whatever the case may be. So you've always got that rolling knowledge within the actual compliance center itself when it comes to these improvement actions. Then you have the solutions themselves, okay? So if you didn't want to go through particular improvement actions and you wanted to see what type of solution gave you what score or what independent configurations, you can come. So if you wanted to pick one, for example, information governance, you can select this and open it and see what remaining items you have inside of your environment to be configured that Microsoft is saying that, hey, here are some configurations that you've not taken into consideration. You can come in here, you can choose or take a look at them to see what they are. You can click on any particular item that you want and know more about it. Again, it takes you straight into the improvement action itself and gives you the configuration details of how to go through that and make your environment more compliant or more compliant to a regulatory standard. Again, you get the same look and feel as you do in any of the improvement actions. They never change depending on what they are. So within assessments then, so assessments are here and they are built out specifically by Microsoft legal minds. So we have internally at Microsoft, we have a massive legal department that goes through and looks through all of the regulations, not just from a financial and insurance perspective. We have here GDPR, we have other localized data sovereignty laws or data regulatory laws. Like I say, like POPIA for South Africa or CCPIA for Canada. They're all in here, okay? There are thousands of them in here. Now, bear in mind, some of them are actually stated as premium assessments, of which I'll touch on in just a moment, and they come at an additional cost. But your standard one is your data protection baseline here. Now, I have these in here because, as I say, I deal with mainly financial services. But let's take a look at this one only because it's got the pending update on. So you go in, you select this, the regulator assessment that you want to be mapped into, okay? Again, when this opens, there's going to be a ton of improvement actions in here that you can go through to configure out, okay? So on the left-hand side, you have exactly the same. You have just a standard template of overview information. And then in the About section, you have the detail around that particular regulation. Then you have the link to the regulation itself. So it gives you the ability to cross-reference what Microsoft have given you from the improvement action and what is in the actual rule itself. In this particular regulation here, we have a 0% assessment. I haven't installed any of this in my environment. If I was to do so, here would be the impact of doing it. You have a physical number here, a numeric value of how many points it would jump up once you configure this particular item. And again, you can go through these items by clicking on the improvement action. Now, once you've gone through this, once you've started to configure these, you'll have a nice graph here, which shows all of these variations at the bottom. So you can keep up to date of any of them that maybe you have deemed out of scope, you have classed as a failed high risk that you need to be implemented in your environment. You've got the option to mark as could not be detected. So if you're looking for specific things from an automation perspective, you can mark it as could not be detected. Then you can investigate that further of why that might be. If this had been implemented, you'd have nice graphical look and feel around what's going on in your environment when it comes to preservation periods. So if you've got items on legal hold, which Sec 17A deems you to have, and you have the preservation records themselves and records and retention, regardless of what the actual regulator is, it will always be broken down into these steps here. So you have none, in progress, past, failed, and out of scope. That then gives you the ability to have that visualization of, hey, I see that some items have failed here. You can click on those failed items, you can click on the graph, and it will actually take you to those items for you to amend them. Here again is the improvement actions that are defined to the SCC 17A rule. So all of these that are in here are all mapped back to that regulation, okay? So you as a financial services environment would have to go through all of these and try to map out all of these configurations into your environment to meet the SEC standard, okay? Now, as I say, GDPR is in there and there's others in there as well that you can take advantage of. But I was always go through any regulation that you're bound to. I would always go into the compliance manager and add the assessment in. At least then you know for sure that you're actually following the configuration that the regulator and Microsoft have come together to give you. So you know at the end of all these configurations, you've done what your environment's asked you to do, you've done what the regulators asked you to do, and you've done what Microsoft has given you to do when it comes to the actual configurations themselves. The good thing about these as well is that when the configuration or when the solutions change in the background, or when the regulator changes items in the background, Microsoft's legal teams will take that on. That will then be filtered down into the configuration steps themselves, or AKA the improvement actions, for you to have the opportunity to update that particular item. So if I click on this one now, you can see at the top here, you have an improvement action, which is a review for update. You can select this and it will give you what that update would be. Okay. And then you can come down here and accept that particular item. This I really, really like, because regulations, they don't change that much, but when they do, sometimes some of the smallest components can change. Microsoft then will map this into the technology for you to keep adherence with those regulations. And lastly, we have the assessment templates. So as I alluded to before, these are everything that you would need from a technology standpoint when it comes to Microsoft Cloud and compliance. As you can see here, we have NIST, we have GDPR, we have EU GDPR for Microsoft 365, we have ISO, we have NIST, FedRAMP, all of these, there's absolutely hundreds of them. So there's 670 in the premium template. Now, when I said to you before, most of these here included templates, these will come with the E3, E5 solution. Now, the premium templates do not. They're an additional cost, and some of them cost up to $30,000 each, okay? But the good thing is, like I say, Microsoft's legal team have already gone to town on these, and then they've gone and given you everything you should need to from a compliance perspective and from a configurations perspective. So that's Compliance Manager. Any questions on this before I move on? Okay. I see Nikki has a hand up.
Yep, just a quick question. When I was looking at this, I couldn't find a way of filtering out where the recommendations required, say, an E3 license or where they required an E5 license. So when you had your screen up there a little while ago, one of them was talking about automatic classification.
Yes.
So that would require your E5 compliance license or the whole of the E5. Yeah. Now, to go up from E3 to E5 is about a 40% uplift. So I work with a lot of companies trying to convince them that it's the right approach. There doesn't seem to be a way here to filter. So if I'm working with a client that says, I'm not going to invest in that, then you want to be able to see how to limit it. Is there a way of doing that?
Not at the moment, but that's a great question, right, Nikki, because this comes up a lot. So when I'm demoing this to customers, they're like, all right, great. So we have a bunch of people on E5, Ryan, but we have a bunch of people on E3. Now, if we enable E5 for one, does that work as a solution suspect, or does that work on an individual basis? Now, most of the time it will be on an individual basis. We can't actually show them that from in the Compliance Manager. Now, the question was raised a couple of months back, whether or not to write this in as a insight into Microsoft, and it was taken on board by the Compliance Manager team. So it's in development at the moment, where you would be able to come into here and, as you say, automatically apply record labels. When you click on the item from an improvement action perspective, let me just find a good example one. Automatically apply client-side labeling, right? When you click on here, you would then get somewhere in this pane, Nikki, the ability to view the licenses required, all right? And that would be, I believe, down the left-hand side when it comes to overview. Let's pretend there's another section here which says licensing model required, and you would have the E3 or E5 below that. But I have no idea when that would be available.
Yeah, because at the moment, that's quite a ask. You have to know, as a kind of consultant, I have to know every single product stack on that. Either the compliance was the same with the security one as well. So when you go down there, you can highlight to the client, oh, actually, you can ignore that one because you haven't got the licenses. You've not made that decision to go there. So you need to take those out of scope. So it's quite a bit of work at the moment to filter those out.
Yeah, it is for me as well as a compliance SME. I have around 37 customers, and if I have to demo this to every single one of them as they're onboarding, you always get the same question. Well, everything automated is E5, right? But at the end of the day, there are some others like E5 for Microsoft Teams. You know, Microsoft Teams DLP. That's an Office 365 E5 solution, but it doesn't tell you that anywhere. If I were to come in here and be able to physically see that, I can identify that to the customer whilst I'm walking through the Compliance Manager. So yeah, we've taken it on board. It is in development, but when that would be available, I just don't know.
Okay, and so I've got one final question.
Sure.
Sorry, I live and breathe.
Get them out, Nikki. It's absolutely fine.
Where are the documents actually held? So, for example, I'm working on this with a global legal company, and we're implementing multi-geo as well. So they're very precious about where the documentation is stored. Is there a way within the compliance manager of being able to select which geo that documentation is going to be stored in?
Yeah, so I'm not too sure if you can pick a specific geo, but it will go into the SharePoint site of where the tenant was created. So as soon as you upload your first document into it, it spins up I won't say an invisible SharePoint site in the background, but a SharePoint site that's not visible to anybody in the SharePoint admin. And then you can actually load the documentation into there. Now, you could, I suspect, go into the SharePoint PowerShell and mark it as a multi-geo reference if you wanted to. So let me ask that question for you tomorrow from product group, and then I'll fire over the answer to Simon or even Dylan, and then they can share that with you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, anytime. Okay, coming over on to data classification then. So within data classification, the first view you get is just basically a dump of your environment when it comes to the audit logs. So it gives you the ability to look at the top items, top sensitivity labels, and top retention labels in your environment. Furthermore, now you get the ability to run the AIP scanner and have those logs come into the overview page as well. But just for a quick overview, we have sensitive information types. We have sensitivity labels, so the maximum count to the lowest count of your environment. And this is over the last 30 days. So it's always a 30-day rolling display that you have here. You have top retention labels applied to content. You then have, again, the IP scanner availability. You have the top detected activities, okay? And each one of these links will take you into the relevant area. Locations where sensitivity labels are applied. So you've got OneDrive, SharePoint, and then you've got locations where retention labels are applied. So that's your information governance. And then you have, again, your top areas, Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. I'll go through trainable classifiers, sensitive information types, and exact data match, but I'll go through them quite quickly. So trainable classifiers give you the ability to train an actual sensitive information type to look for a specific type of document and content within that document. You have a bunch of them here, which Microsoft give you from a default perspective. So I would always use the default ones first and foremost if you can. Some of these are actually used throughout your environment without you knowing, like in communications compliance and so on and so forth. Then you've got the resume, CVs, source code, and then target harassment. So all these here would be built into different languages, different types of contexts, of course. And then you've got the threat side of them as well, which are also built out into multiple languages. I see trainable classifiers being used a lot by very large organizations when they're looking for certain types of documents like invoices, bank statements, customer reference documentation, medical documentation, insurance documentation, and so on and so forth. Sensitive information types. Let's wait for it to load. So sensitive information types, they're specifically built out for various items, okay? So as you can see here, we have ABA routing number, we have credit card, we have EU debit card, national insurance. These are also mapped into some types of regulations. So there's templates built out for GDPR. So there's templates built out for financial services, which will wrap in these sensitive information types like credit card numbers, EU debit card, passports, and so on and so forth. You can go through these and choose any of these. You can either wrap this into a DLP policy or an auto-labeling policy, client side or service side, which I'll show you later on when it comes to information protection. These are always being updated. At the moment, Microsoft have another 55 that are going through approval at the moment. And these will cover off things like, again, the POPIA for South Africa, CCPIA for Canada. We have a number of them through here. But more importantly, there's been updates to these over the last couple of months around actual IP addresses and MAC addresses and people's names and physical addresses and so on and so forth. So you can use these to your own advantage. So if you're wanting to search for that type of data or a specific type of sensitive information type, you would wrap that into the relevant solution, and it would go off and find all the data that maps that particular, either it be a regex or a keyword list or a keyword dictionary. You can, of course, build your own out, and you can build them out with regex, keyword lists, and dictionaries. You can build them up with other supporting elements. Let's take, for example, you have a credit card number. You can build out with specific supporting elements called the CVC or the expiry date or the actual card name, or to look for a first name, last name, and so on and so forth. They're very, very good, and you can extend them to whatever capabilities you want to. Exact data matches, I don't see many people using this because of the complexities of setting them up, but what they can do for you is they can work as a sensitive information type themselves. And if you have a document, let's take a medical record, for example, or patient data, for example, and that patient data is always turned around inside of that template, but the columns and the headers inside of the document stay the same. You can map those headers, columns, whatever the case may be, those titles into that EDM schema, and then you can tell it, just look at the schema, and it will follow that documentation around. So you can actually wrap again into retention periods and sensitivity labels and so on and so forth. But they're quite, well, I say quite, they're actually very complex to set up, because you have to have the schema absolutely right. It has to be unique throughout your environment. There can't be any other documentation that has the same. So yeah, not one to go with now. There's actually an EDM version 2 coming out very soon, which I believe is in the new year, which will give you a very, very easier approach to building them out. So look out for that if any of your customers are actually interested in exact data match. Content Explorer, let's give it a second to load up. So Content Explorer then will give you that 30-day view or 90-day view of whatever is in your environment, okay? So if you've only been online for 30 days, it will actually go back, sorry, if you actually just configure this over the last 30 days, it will actually go back through your environment and pick out any of the sensitive information types that we've picked from this portal here. And it will give you the ability to do a deep dive into that data as well. Down here, you also have sensitivity labels and retention labels. So any labeling in your environment, that is also displayed in here as well. I really like this. I think it's a fantastic product, but it does come with one bit of a, I won't say a downside, but just one thing that you should be noticed or should note is the fact that if you come in here and you have permissions in here and you have the Content Explorer Content Diver, if you like, you can actually select the items here. You can go into the SharePoint site where that data is located. And then if you have the relevant permissions, you can actually open the item. When I'm demoing this to customers, they're like, well, that's too much information to give a certain person within a SOC or a compliance admin or somebody who works in logging, monitoring, and alerting. So Microsoft, the last couple of months, they recently split out the permissions for this. So if you've just got the basic permissions, you would just get this view here where you can actually see the locations of where they're applied, but not the items within it. So just bear that in mind when you're walking your customers through this. This is an E5 solution, and it's an E5 because you actually drill down into the data of the users themselves. Let's take a look at Activity Explorer. Activity Explorer gives you, as it states, all the activity in your environment, okay? So anybody's matched the DLP rule, anybody's applied a label to a document, whether that be via an auto-labeling policy or manually, whether somebody's downgraded a label from highly confidential to confidential or from highly confidential to public, it will give you that information. It will also go through your Microsoft Teams DLP to say somebody's tried to share certain types of data. This works with EndPoint DLP as well. So you get to see all of the activity in your environment. You get the ability then, if you want to turn on specific things for, somebody's read an encrypted file or read a file that has a sensitivity label applied to it, or a SharePoint site or OneDrive site, or even a team channel that has a label applied to it. That's data classification. Any questions on this? All right, great. So let's take a look at information protection. Okay, so information protection then gives you the ability to build out sensitivity labels to protect the items within your environment. Now, as you'll see, I have quite a lot in here, but I only have them for demo purposes. I would not in any way, shape, or form tell you to have almost 19 labels, okay? The best thing to do when it comes to sensitivity labels is build out a basic taxonomy. And that basic taxonomy can just be a general label that has no encryption on it, which users can apply to their items, so you have identification of those items themselves. Then you would have confidential labels and highly confidential labels. Now, I've done them this way, so you have sub-labels within the parent label. That gives the user the ability to identify what type of label it is and what type of document they're going to label with it. So in my examples here, I have 3. I have confidential recipients only, which is usually defined as user-defined permissions. I then have the confidential internal, and I have an example auto-labeling one. Let's take a look through, and I'll show you the recipients only one first and what that does. This is a very, very popular label. So you would come through, you would select files and emails. Now you'll see I've not chosen groups or sites to anything under my confidential and highly confidential. There's a reason why I do that, and I'll get to that when I get to the groups and sites labeling. And then within here, you would select encrypt files and emails and mark the content of the files. Now, this particular permission here, let users assign permissions, does not exist unless you actually select the encrypted item, okay? When you come through to here and select let users assign permissions, you select in Outlook. So any recipient that you put in the to, CC, or BC field within Outlook would only be the users that can consume that item. They're the only ones that can open that item. And we also put on the do not forward. So they cannot forward that particular item on. When you come into Word, if you go into Word and select that label, it brings up a pop-up box. That pop-up box then gives you the ability to apply the relevant permissions to the relevant recipients, knowing full well that once that you've saved that document and it's shared to the recipients that have been included in it, they are the only ones that can open that document, okay? Again, very simple configuration. You have the ability to choose a watermark, a header, and a footer. I will say I find very, very small use cases for using a watermark. Most companies will find it an irritation if it's across the actual middle of the page, and it makes it hard for reading. So 99.9% of my customers will come in and select header and footer. A very small use case for watermarks is secret. I've only ever seen that once in one massive organization, one financial organization, I should say, that chose to use secret only because they was actually building out product sets within it. Then we have auto-labeling. We never use auto-labeling for recipients only because we never understand what that concept is going into the actual data itself. It's just where it's being shared to, okay? And then we have the groups and site stuff, for which I'll get to in just a moment. And then for the internal label then, so we know that we have an ability to label items as confidential internal. And we only want people within our organization to be open, to be able to open the item. Again, only files and emails have been selected here. Encrypt, mark content, as you would expect. And then we'd have assign permissions now. So we're on the last one, we have recipients only, where we get the users define the permissions. This is the second option in that box. But for our case, we're going to assign permissions now. And to do that, we come down to this blue banner here. We select the permissions, and then we choose add all users and groups in your organization. Now, One thing to bear in mind here is when you select that, okay, it looks at the vanity domain of what you're using, okay? So if I select this now, okay, you'll see it uses the actual Microsoft 365 tenant name, okay? But when it does the routing, it uses your vanity domain. So when you get this pop-up in here, I get lots of customers coming to me saying, it's not working properly. It's actually picking the on Microsoft.com address. That's actually right. It will do because it uses this address to do the routing. So this is normal. Don't think it's an error. It's actually there for a purpose. So when you select this will choose everybody that has this domain appended to them. Nobody else can get access into this environment. You have additional options where you add any authenticated user, and that could be anybody, whether they have an Azure AD account in your environment or not, or whether they have an internet mail enabled account, they'll be able to authenticate and grab this item. Then you have users or groups. Now, when I see the users and groups being used, it will only be for specific scenarios, more prominently for the secret label, because the secret label, from my experience, has always been your top level board members, the people that make the decisions, your stakeholders, and so on and so forth, you know, the big bosses of the actual environments that you're working in. And they'll be selected within a group that's been created within 365 groups. And that will be added in here as well. Now, an additional component in here is add specific email addresses or domains. When you select this, I see this being used more predominantly for third parties. So if you have a company that has a sister company or has a general conversation with, let's say, a bank and a regulator or a bank and an Ofcom, you can add in the third party address in here. So they too can actually receive this item as encrypted, and they'll be authorized to open it because their domain would be in here. There's additional configurations in here. So you have user access content expires. Now, depending on the label and depending on the organization, it varies. This is usually used within sales, marketing, where you want to expire an item, or a contract where you want to expire an item, and you can come in here, select a specific date, or select a number of days before the item is expired. On top of that, you have allow offline access. Now, within Microsoft, we always say, as a recommendation, add in a number, okay? Whether it be 3 days or whether it be 30 days, add in a number. That then forces that user who's already consumed that item to go back through the Azure AD and RMS, logging on and making sure they've still got access to the item. That authentication string is what the word I'm looking for. So you know that every 30 days, anybody that's had access to it has to go back through that. Then again, saying to the user, you still have access, or you can revoke access for that label, for that person, or that group of people, whatever the case may be. It's always good to have a number in here, whatever the case may be. Again, standard configuration through here, and I'm not going to go into AutoLabel. I'll show you that on another label now. So this is called AutoLabeling, but this is AutoLabeling client side. Now it's client side because you do need the unified labeling client to do the detection of the data. And I shall show you through now into the sensitive information type, which I've got mapped in. So standard configuration on that side, and then we come into AutoLabeling. Now, I've chosen one of the sensitive information types of which we were talking about previously under the data classification. Now, you can map any sensitive information type in here, whether it be a default one or whether it be a custom set sensitive information type that you've created for your organization. It really doesn't matter. When you map that in here, you come into here and you click sensitive information type. That will then give you the list that we saw before for you to add in. When it detects this, or these words, or that regular expression, that keyword dictionary on the document or within the email body, it will actually come up and recommend a label or automatically apply the label. Now, Microsoft has a metaphor of crawl, walk, run. The crawl and walk stages would be manually applying the label. The walk would be recommend the label, and then the run would be to swap this to the automatically apply the label. Now, I have customers that have been using recommend label for 4 or 5 months, and they're still not ready to go into the fully automated side of it. So I would be very cautious when you're using this. It's a great tool, but I think the recommended label is fantastic. It doesn't apply it. It just gives the user the indication to apply it. Then you can have down here what we call a display or a policy tip to say, we've detected Project Falcon or financial services information or PII, whatever the case may be, completely up to you as an organization to build that out to your requirements. And then it would say, therefore, we recommend the correct label be applied. And it would give you the label to apply. So it would be highly confidential, confidential internal, whatever the case may be. Whatever label you want to apply to that sensitive information type that's wrapped into that auto label is completely down to your own customization of how you want to work it. Any questions on that before I move on to groups and sites? All right, great. So as I mentioned, first and foremost, you can see in here, all of my, what we call item level labels are actually just covered for file and email. Now, the reason why Microsoft recommend you build them out separately is because if you have access to a label that is under confidential and you have the site and unified group in there as well, if that is applied to a SharePoint site, a Microsoft team, or a Microsoft 365 group, and you have access to that item or that container level layer, you can actually go in as a user and remove that label. Okay. Most of the companies that I deal with do not want that scenario. They don't want you to, the admin to apply confidential internal or highly confidential internal to that container level layer, and then for some user to go in, remove it, exfiltrate data, and then put it back on. So what we suggest is that you build the groups and sites like labels separately. And then you would build a separate policy for them as well, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, the groups and sites labels, as I say, give you the ability to apply a label at the container level. Those containers are 365 groups, Microsoft Teams chats and channels, and SharePoint sites. There's a bunch of configuration that you can use. Now, I've built mine out on every single scenario because I have to demo every single scenario. But usually in your environment, you will either go for allow external sharing, allow Teams and SharePoint, or block. Okay, but for today's example, I'm going to show you a very common one that I come across a lot, with the confidential one here. So again, standard configuration at the front of the label as you were doing for file and email, but this time you're selecting groups and sites. You have no ability to encrypt because at the moment, groups and sites or container level labeling does not support encryption by inheritance. And then you would come through here and you have two options then under the groups and sites, okay? You have the privacy and external user access. So control the level of access that internal and external users will have to label teams. That should be a capital T, Microsoft, and then Microsoft 365 groups, okay? So this was what you control teams and groups with. And then the bottom one, as it states, control sharing and configure conditional access settings to protect labeled SharePoint sites, okay? So the bottom one is for SharePoint, the top one is for groups and teams. Now, within here, if anybody's used to seeing SharePoint configuration and SharePoint settings, you will see that in here now it's very familiar. What Microsoft have done, they've taken those back-end security policies from SharePoint and now added them onto the actual label itself. So you can come through here and you can say, right, I want to put some control on external sharing. Okay, so I'm going to say I want new and existing guests. But when I have a new and existing guest come in, if they're coming in from a managed device, which they would be doing, I'm going to allow limited access. Now, that limited access would give you the ability for them to view it in a web browser, but with no ability to download, print, or sync files or copy and paste from that particular item. I have a large car manufacturer at the moment that is using this scenario, and it works very well for them. So they can share their designs with other third parties and other vendors. They can see the content, but they can't actually do anything with it. And that works very well. I see a couple of law firms using this also to actually share data out, to do cross-referencing of particular statements and so on and so forth. So it's very, very good. So that's how you would get limited access on a SharePoint site. Let me show you a couple more. Quite cautious of time here, so I might speed this up. Let's show you how to block teams in SharePoint. So again, you would come in and go to groups and sites. Again, no ability to encrypt. And then you would select both of them. And this is to block both SharePoint and Teams, okay? And 365 groups. Then you would select private, and you would not select external user access. Then you would come through and say only people in your organization, so no sharing allowed, and then block. So if that guest user tries to come in or that external user tries to come in, they will get completely blocked from accessing the site. Now, just one last one I'll show you is this one here. This is relatively new to labeling. And it's to add in an actual context here. Now, this is in preview, but you still get Microsoft support and technical support on this should you wish to use it. And what I've done here is I've wrapped in a conditional access policy. And that conditional access policy states, I'm going to allow you into the environment if you're coming from an unmanaged device and you're a new or existing guest, but I'm going to make you MFA. Okay, so you have to go through that two-factor authentication to get to that data or to get to that site or that intellectual property in the background. Additionally, this will take any configuration from a conditional access policy. So I have some customers out there that will use request for our MFA, but additionally make sure that the device is compliant. Make sure it's not jailbroken. Make sure it's up to a certain level from a hygiene perspective, and so on and so forth. So you're allowing the access in, but you're putting these conditions around the user to say, okay, I know who you are now, but I'm going to add some additional context here, and you have to meet these conditional access policy criteria. That's information protection labeling. I know that's very quick, but I'm cautious of time. Is there any questions on that before I move on?
Ryan, well, one thing, don't worry if you overrun, unless you've got somewhere to be. We're quite relaxed about these things. But it's really great stuff. They talk about conditional access policy. Would you then would that allow you to sort of get somebody to sort of kind of assign some or read some T's and C's as well through the conditional access too? If you created a policy where you sort of enforced MFA, could you get someone to kind of do the terms and conditions? What do they call it in conditional access, where you've got kind of a
absolutely. So lots of my customers will actually wrap in a conditional access policy with end user agreements on them, and they'll say, if you're accessing this environment, first of all, you've got to accept these terms and conditions from an end user perspective. You've also got to MFA, and you've also got to go through these these compliance policies as well. So yeah, absolutely. I would always recommend, great ad there, Simon. I would always recommend when you're building this out, because that user is not part of your environment, you're limited on what you can actually do. So end user terms and agreements, whatever you want to call it, always add them in as well as an extra layer of support. So you know that particular end user has agreed to those terms and conditions. So if they do anything out of the ordinary, or they do exfiltrate data, you've got some legal capture there as well.
Yeah. Cool, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Cheers, Simon. Go ahead, Nikki, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question regarding the prioritization of the labels. I noticed that you'd got the groups and sites at a lower level than the label. I had thought, and I'd read, that the groups and sites should be the highest possible label, because what you can get is, if you've got a low label classifying the container, if you then try and put a higher priority piece of content like a file in there, you get an error message to say, do you really want to do this? The container is a low level and you're trying to put top secret in it. So I thought the best practice was to have groups and sites labels higher than your file labels.
You're absolutely right. And the only reason why I have it the way I have it is just for demo purposes. I would probably do 90% of my time in these here, and then 10% of my time in the ones in groups and sites labels. So I built them out in a way that I built them that I do them most regularly. So That might be confusing to some, but you're absolutely right. You should always have your limited factors when it comes to the container layers at the top end. So that would be your highest level label. And then the item level ones would fit into the container levels based on the actual numeric value here you have from an order perspective. So good shout there, Nikki. Any other questions on labeling?
Are you going to talk about the licensing aspects of all this separately, or do you want to talk about it as we encounter it?
So we can talk about it afterwards if you want, Dylan, but do you have a specific licensing question in mind?
Not really, just in terms of which features demand which licenses, which is always what people want to know in the end, isn't it? How much it's going to cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nikki touched on that just a moment ago. But I'll go through that. So if you want, as I'm going through things, I'll actually mark out what type of licensing you would need. So coming back to information protection, it's pretty much all E3 unless you're using the automated side of things. So auto labeling from a client side or auto labeling from a service side, which I'll show you in just a second, they would always be E5. So as I always say, any of the standard stuff is just basically there for you to use, but any of the cool stuff like automation, machine learning, and so on and so forth, they will always be E5. But I'll show you an E5 feature now. So auto labeling then within information protection, this is the service side auto labeling. Okay, so where we've just been through the client side, this is the service side. Now, when you're building this out, you can map in sensitive information types to do those scans throughout your environment. Okay. Now, one thing to note is that it works with these three workloads here. Okay. Now, Exchange email is not data at rest. It's data in transit. So the email has to go through the transit pipeline to get the tag of the data for the data to be recorded. But SharePoint sites and OneDrive account, they're data at rest. So what you can do with auto labeling service side, and what most of my customers use this for, is to understand that data landscape when it comes to Microsoft 365 or Office 365. So you can build out specific policies here, and then you can map in any of these particular sensitive information types that I have here into that labeling policy and say to it, go through my environment and find all of this information. Okay. I have customers that are using custom sensitive information types in here, as well as the default ones that I have here. Once you get that back, once it's done that scan, you can get that report then and understand where your data is situated, what types of data you have in what repositories. So one of my customers today was going through a review of the data that they had, and they didn't even realize that they had some really serious, really intellectual property just scattered around people's OneDrives. They was able to get that insight into that and then alert the users to the fact that, hey, this data shouldn't be on your OneDrive. Your OneDrive is for personal use. The SharePoint sites here are labeled with the relevant labeling, so you can add those items into that particular point. The other good benefit of this is that you can auto label those items as well. Now, I must say, I haven't had any customers the last 5 months that have used the auto labeling. They've only used it in simulation mode. And that simulation mode allows for that scan. They will go and scan all of that data just to get that data landscape back. Let's take a look at a policy. So within here, I have just a relevant description, and then the 3 workloads it works with. And then you would choose the actual rule itself. So as like a DLP policy, it looks very much the same. You can come in here, add in the sensitive information types of which you want that scan to look for to understand that data landscape. Then you would click save, and it would go off and start to log. Now, you can build separate rules out, okay, for each of the workloads should you wish to do so. I don't see many people doing that. It would always be a repetitive motion. Then you would come through to the label itself. So you would have to choose a label within here, okay, of what you want to apply. Now, you don't have to apply that label automatically. You're just telling the policy, if you find all of this data, this is the label that I would like to apply. You need the label in it to go through the settings. So just choose, I've just chose a random label there, but within your environment, choose the one that you would like to apply. Because if you're going through that data and you're repeatedly doing a scan for that data, there will be a point where all those matched items that you're working through are actually 99.9% correct. Okay, then you can go through, if you're confident enough, and just apply the auto labeling itself. And then it will go all the way through your environment and apply that label to all the documents that it finds. Okay. Then you have here, you will notice that there is no on switch. Okay. Microsoft have done this purposely. So you can't just select on and it go all the way through your environment and start labeling stuff. As anybody knows, when you've got DLP policies running off sensitive information types, you get a lot of false positives the first few weeks. So Microsoft don't want you to give you the ability to go and label a load of data that doesn't need that label. And you have it ended up encrypting those items as well. So in here, you have the run in policy mode. Sorry, you run policy in simulation mode. And that's pretty much it. Once it's switched on, it takes about 24 hours to go through the process. The auto labeling engine only runs twice a day. Okay. And then you get back this view here. Within here, then you can go through and have a look to see what items it's matched. You come through to the items to review. And then within here, then you can actually look at the items it's found. When you select the items, you can go through each and every one of them and you can mark them as a match, as a non-match, or like a false positive if you like. And then you can start to work through whether or not you're comfortable for that policy to be switched on, which would be here. Once you switch it on, like I say, it will go through and start auto labeling everything. And as I say, I don't see many customers doing that. Maybe one or two that I've had over the last 6-7 months that I've actually gone through and done that. And it's only been in pretty much test sites anyway. Then you can, they can see more importantly, that data landscape. That's what I see this being used for more predominantly. Any questions on this before I go on to information governance?
Yeah, a licensing question. Obviously, this is E5.
Yes.
Who needs to have E5 for this to work? What's the scope? Does everybody need to have an E5, or does it need to be the person who's applying these, creating these rules? Just for clarity's sake.
Right. Okay. So the easiest way to remember this, if you're getting user data back, it is the users that need the license. And as we see here, we see the documentation from the user perspective. Okay. Same with Activity Explorer, same with Content Explorer. If you're doing that, drilling down into the user's data, E5 for the users. Absolutely done. Not just for the admin. Even though if you apply this to one person in the environment, it does give you the ability to pull that data back.
Okay, so hypothetically, if a document library was populated with data from, say, 5 different people, then you would need 5 E5 licenses for those people to cover you.
Yes, yes.
And it's based on the user who created the data or everybody who's touched it, because obviously a file might be edited, a document might be edited by multiple people through its lifespan.
I'm not sure on that question. I'd have to ask, but I think if you input it into the document and you are the last modifier of the document and it pulls it back into here, you would need that E5 license to do that drill down into the actual document itself.
Yeah. Okay.
They were actually. Sorry, go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah. Forgive me being specific, but it makes a difference.
No, you're fine.
Some documents which could be touched by 10 people.
Yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from, and that's a very good question. And I actually talked to product lead tomorrow, so I'll ask that question. Is it based on user created or user modified?
Thank you.
No, you're welcome. So information governance then. So this is where you would come to build out any time-based retention labels or retention policies themselves. Labels are different. Labels are the ones that are the old retention tags coming from Exchange, where you have the ability to apply the item, to apply the retention at the item level rather than the workload level. Within information governance in here, apart from adaptive scopes and policy lookups, everything is E3. let's take an example one here. Within the actual label itself, you can build out the time-based retention that you want to keep it for. Okay. Also, if you have an E5, you can trigger for a disposition review, which I'll go through in just a moment. So this is a standard information governance template. In here, you select the years, how long you want to keep it for. You can add a custom one in as well. I have some customers that are based out of some data sovereign areas around the world, and some of these have to be 20, 25 years. So you can add in a selection there of whatever you want it to be. I see this being used, the custom one being used a lot for like Teams chats, team channel chats, where you just want to get rid of them after 2 years or a year or something like that. Then you can create a new event type, which I'll go through in just a moment. And then you have additional options here for retain items forever, only delete items when they reach a certain age, or don't retain or delete items. So depending on what your retention schedule looks like from your organization perspective, you can pretty much build out any scenario when it comes to information governance. And this would be the label itself. So this is the actual thing that's applied to the item. And then you would come through to label policies. So this is the policy. So whom needs to have this, okay? You can also auto apply them as well, which I'll show you now. So retention and auto applying a retention, E5, okay? When you come through to here, you can select a number of options. As it states here, you have apply label to content that contains a sensitive information type. So those are the information types we were talking about previously. Then we've got apply label to content that contains specific words or phrases or properties. So if you know there's a repetition of words through your documentation in your environment, and now those documents need to have a retention applied to them, you can use this you can use these specific words and phrases to apply that retention policy to them. And then you've got trainable classifiers, which we touched on very lightly before. Now, I have some customers that are using trainable classifiers, but not from a retention perspective. I think there's still a little bit more maturity from a Microsoft standpoint to build these out a little bit. And then you have the actual sensitive information types that you want to map in. So because I've selected sensitive information type, I've then added in the relevant sensitive information types that I have, okay? So if it detects a US Social Security number or a DA number and one of these particular sensitive information types here, it will apply that retention to that documentation. You can also use it for sensitivity labels as well. So if you apply a sensitivity label to a document, okay, and that sensitivity label has the same sensitive information types mapped into it from a retention label perspective, it will apply the relevant retention period to that document, okay? Then we have new options in here. So previously we just had a static option, and now we have adaptive scope policies, which I'll touch on in just a moment. And then you have the scope of it. Okay, so who needs to see this retention policy? Who needs to be included in it? Okay, you add that in here for all of the workloads that you can see here. Okay, they're trying to bring Microsoft Teams into here, but then they can't do it just yet. So within here, you would select either all mailboxes, all sites, or certain sites, all accounts, or certain accounts, and then all groups, or certain groups. Then you would go through and add in the label, the retention label of which you want included into that policy. Okay, so you build your label out first, then you build the policy out and include the label in it. Okay, now we have two different types of records here as well. Okay, we have a regulatory record and then we have an internal versioning record. Now, these two here, I will touch on a bit later in records management here. But for now, I'll continue going through here. So then you have retention policies. Now, retention policies are down to the actual workloads themselves. So, you know, think of Exchange and keeping data for so long within Exchange, or SharePoint or OneDrive. The same applies in here. So again, you have the standard approach now, which you have the two options within here. And then you have the locations. So where do you want this apply to from a time-based retention period perspective? Exchange, you can just use these on a singular value as well. And then you have, exactly as we saw in the retention label, you have the ability to apply how many years you want this to be done for, when the item was created or when the item was modified. And then you have delete items automatically, do nothing, retain items forever, or only delete. You do not get a disposition on retention period policies that are per workload. You only get them per item load. Okay. And then we have adaptive scope policies, but let me just show you the other two E3 features here, which is the import. So I see this being used a lot when it comes to large organizations that have compliance archives. And those compliance archives will be emails from a very long time ago, years and years ago, before they moved to cloud. Because they've exported that data out into PST, if they go through an investigation or an advanced e-discovery case, and they need to hold that data or put a retention period to that data, or they just want to put all of their PSTs into cloud, this is where you would come and use the import job to import all of that data into 365. So you have a complete breakdown in 365 of all of your emails, regardless of there being modern email or PST email. Then you have the archiving selection. So just think of the old Exchange Online archiving. This is where you would come now in 365 to mark out the particular items that you want to enable or disable the mailbox archive on. Okay, adaptive scope policies. This is very new from Microsoft, and this is certainly an E5 feature. So what adaptive scope policies do, they allow you to build out policies based on attributes, okay? So let's have a look at this scope detail here, and then I'll walk you through how to create one just so you can understand what it is that's happening in the background. So on this one here, I have this predominantly done for executive members, okay? And then I have a description for 10 years. And my user type on this one is user. Now there's three types that you can use. Is user, SharePoint site, and then groups, okay? And then in my query summary, I have, as long as that person's title starts with executive, this policy will apply. So it's based on the attribute title. And then within the title, it has to have executive. This works for all manner of scenarios. I see customers using this from a geographical perspective. So if somebody has Germany in their country, or USA in their country, or Australia, or whatever the case may be, you'll be able to apply the relevant time-based period within that policy to that attribute, okay? This works well in a multi-geo company because lots of companies, lots of countries around the world will have different retention periods applied to them. Let's take Switzerland as a prime example as a data sovereignty area. That will have a different retention period applied than the rest of the world. Now, within the query itself, if you had country Switzerland, you could then apply the 20 years or the 15 years that's relevant to that organization. Now, if somebody was to move out of that country and their country would change from Switzerland to England, then once they flip over onto the England attribute, they would then get the English retention period, okay? But I'll show you how to go through one of those. Now, as you see in here, okay, you can do the same when it comes to SharePoint site. So you can use the site name or the site URL to apply a retention policy to it, okay? So if you have a specific documentation in that SharePoint site and the attribute or the SharePoint site or URL name, should I say, matches a specific requirement or a specific configuration, it will auto apply that retention policy to that area. The same for Microsoft 365 groups as well. So if you wanted to bundle lots of people up, which I see from an inactive mailbox perspective, so you would have a group that says inactive mailboxes, okay? Once you add that user into that group and they have that flag from that dynamic group, that attribute is updated. It's updated on the user and then it's updated within the adaptive scope policies. So you can automatically keep that inactive mailbox data. Therefore, you don't have to apply the retention policy before you make the mailbox inactive. You can now do it after the fact, as long as you do it within the 30 days, of course. So on the user side here, we build out a specific query and work out whatever it is that you want to work out. So let's say our example, say country or region, and is equal to, let's say, Swiss. Okay. We now know that anybody that has that country or region is mapped into Swiss will get a specific retention period. Okay. Whenever they're added into that particular policy, whenever they're taken out of that policy, that retention period will be diminished. Okay. Here are all of the attributes that you can use. Now, this does take into effect that everybody's Azure AD is as clean as it should be and as organized as it should be. Now, I'm sure everybody on the call will agree that not many companies will have all of these attributes set and configured properly. So if you're ever going to use this, I would always make sure it's an actual attribute that is fully utilized. I have customers at the moment that want to get onto this and use this, but their Azure AD is in such a mess, they don't have half of these actually enabled. They'll have the username and first name and display name, but sometimes job title or department or office or street address or whatever the case it is or whatever they want to use is not done. And most of these custom attributes will be used by other things. Okay, so just bear that in mind. And that's it. That's just basically how you build that adaptive scope policy. Then you have the policy lookup preview. So this will use the KQ querying, okay, for you to have the ability to look up specific items in your environment. So if you have lots of adaptive scope policies that are built off specific queries, you can look for them in here and it will only bring back those items to save you from going through each and every adaptive scope policy to find that query-based policy configuration, if you like. Any questions on these before I move on to records management? Okay.
I do actually. I was just trying to find my microphone. So this is a particular area of interest of mine. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Could you just walk us through setting up one particular information governance policy, just to make sure we've got the end-to-end process clear? And then my related question is going to be, what can you screw up in this process? What can you inadvertently or just fumble and end up, destroying something or creating a future problem for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me walk you through a particular. You're talking about label policies and labels here, Simon, right? So I
think I am, but I think pick a scenario and go. And this is what you would do as a small company or a big company, for that matter. To get this particular piece of information governance established.
Okay, so let me just go back a couple of steps. And so labels are items that labels are retention policies that you can apply to items. So let's say we're in a mailbox, okay, and we see an email come through that has a contract assigned to it. I can then pick out that label and apply it to that document, okay?
Yep.
A retention policy is per workload. So if it's assigned to SharePoint or assigned to Exchange, everything in that workload gets that time-based period, okay? Now,
perfect. Yep.
I see retention policies, they're a one-off. Okay, so you create one and that's it. It goes out to that workload and it spreads across that workload and the data is kept within it. Okay. More often, I see these more as a popular demand within labels. Okay, only because you're giving the user then or the user the ability to tag that data with a certain retention-based period. Okay, so let's walk through one of these then. So standard configuration.
So for example, I guess it might be a project document where we say, this project's going to run for 2 years, therefore we need to keep it for 2 years plus a 3-year hangover because of some contract that says that's what we've got to do.
Okay, so within here then, you would just pick out, if it's a 2-year retention period, you would just pick out the 2-year retention period here, okay? And then because you've chosen a custom one, it shows you custom underneath. Then when you come through to the start retention period based on, now, this has a number of items in here that you can choose from, okay? But for this example, we'll go from when created.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. We'll go from when created. Now, the problem here is do you need a disposition review or not? If you choose a disposition review, and I will do so for the benefit of this in this example, so we can have a look at the disposition review, you can have up to 5 people within a disposition review. So that is what Microsoft call multi-stage disposition, okay? So you as the end user can say, yes, I'm happy for this to be deleted, and that can go all the way through the stack to the CTO or to the compliance officer, whatever the case may be, right? So within here, you choose trigger for disposition. But if you didn't want that and you didn't want anything to happen, okay, and I have some customers at the moment that are trialing this out, they will just select do nothing, okay? So all they want to do is see what data they have that would expire in 7, 10, 12, 15 years, okay? They add in the disposition review and they go through the items, all right? So let's take a look. So you come through then to the disposition review side. So you come through and you add in stage 1, okay, or whatever you want to call it. Let's call it user defined. So you say to the user, you are the first stage in this disposition review. You build out a second one, and then you say user manager, for example, okay? And then you would have multiple stages, okay? Within here, you would add in specific users. Let's say it's Megan's data, and then you want the administrator, whatever the case may be. So once Megan has approved that she's happy for that data to be deleted, it would then go through onto the next stage, okay? So you have complete visibility of that data going all the way through the actual reviewers, the disposition reviewers, should I say, before it's actually committed for deletion. Now, prior to having multi-stage disposition, there was only one person allowed. And once that person had committed that data for deletion, that's it. It's gone out the window for completion, okay? The actual disposition engine runs every Thursday, and then every Friday, once that data is committed, that Friday engine, deletion engine, will purge that data for deletion and just delete that data, okay? The next step of that would just be creating that label, okay? So we've created the label that we want to apply to the item, and we've created the time-based period within that label, all right? It does take a minute, so.
Okay, and you said before, just while we're waiting for that to do its thing, so this is for individual items, so I can pick effectively any item across the estate and go apply this label to this thing, whereas the policy says apply this to everything inside that container.
Yeah, so in the label itself, you pick out the time-based period, but in the policy, you choose the users who actually get access to that label, okay, which I'll just show you in a moment.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Sorry, it does take a couple of minutes.
It does take a while. Yeah, I've played with this a bit, but I struggle sometimes to keep the whole process in my head.
That's okay, no problem.
And again, while we're waiting, what are sensible names? So if I've got a set of different types of document that have a 7-year retention period, should I call it 7-year retention, or would I call it, for example, director contracts or something like that?
Well, I mean, it varies because it depends on the environment from what I've seen, Simon, where I would always say, give it an appropriate name, but add the numeric value onto the end of it. So you'd have contracts 7, contracts 10, so on and so forth. And the 7 obviously being the time-based period of what you want to keep that data for, okay? Some companies don't like to do that. They just want the basic normality of this is a contract, this is an employment contract, this is a vendor contract, whatever the case may be, okay? Therefore, in the background, the user already knows, doesn't need to know how long it's kept for. They just mark the data as whatever it needs to be and let the governance team deal with the time-based period in the background.
Okay, so if I've got 7 different classes of document, all of which happen to have a 7-year retention period and everything else is the same, I just create that label. I just create 7 instances of that same, effectively same label, but with a different name.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Gotcha.
One argument I heard against putting the name in there is it's not easy to change the name. And if the law changes and you have to change the retention period, then the name's stranded, isn't it?
That's right, Dylan. So
Okay.
that's a good question that's come up a few times. So if a regulation changes, okay, and the name changes around that regulation, then you're stuck, because once the actual configuration engine submits the retention or the DLP policy, they're exactly the same, or even the label, sensitivity label, once it's pushed service side, you cannot change that name.
Okay, that's important to know.
Yeah, you cannot change that name. What you would have to do is create another retention policy with the new name, submit that, okay, service side, let that take precedence, and just be wary, it can take up to 7 days for a retention policy to be submitted and configured on the service side for it to be available and work in the actual applications, then remove the old one. Therefore, that gives you what we call in Microsoft the time to alleviate any naked data. And naked data being that doesn't have any governance assigned to it whatsoever, or any retention period assigned to it whatsoever. Okay, you would never want to be in that position if you're under any regulation. So you would always run them as an overlapping policy. When the new one's taken place, remove the old one.
Okay. And can you, in that case, apply the new label or policy to the to the data that is already labeled?
No, so what you'd have to do, wait for that to show up in Exchange, or in Outlook, should I say. Okay, once you see that in Outlook, you can then take over with the new one. The old one will apply until you overlap it with the new one. So if you have old items, okay, that have that retention policy applied to, okay, and you remove it, you're removing the actual policy from the item
I get
itself. That. Okay, cool. So going through creating a label then. So as we go through to publish this label, once you finish the label configuration, Microsoft now gives you the ability to build out the policy straight away. So as you can see here, I get the opportunity to publish this label. All right, so I select done, and this will take me through to the next steps without me having to go back into the portal to open the policies themselves. As you can see, I have this already built in for me. I can then go through. I'm not going to select an adaptive scope for this time. I'm just going to go through in a static one. Okay. Now, within here is where you choose the locations of where you want this available. So where do you want the users to have the ability to apply this label? Okay. Let's not select Microsoft 365 groups. So I know that I'm going to get a contract that comes through email, or I'm going to get one shared to me via SharePoint or OneDrive. Okay. You add in your name, you add in your description, and that's you done. Okay.
Okay. So again, thinking about the name, given the naming convention we had for the label itself, should the policy name somehow reference that label? How do you make that linkage between the two?
So, excuse me. So what I always suggest is, if you have an employee contracts label, just name it employee contracts. If you have a policy that maps to that, Simon, you have employee contracts policy. Okay.
Gotcha.
So you know, whenever you go into the environment, if you're in PowerShell or you're in the actual portal itself, you can distinguish between the two here of whether or not it is the policy, or, as I've got here, or the actual label itself. So as you can see here, I have policy, medical records retention policy, but on the first page, I just have I have medical records policy there as well, but that's an error. So that shouldn't be there. So you can actually see, I always say to customers, whatever the case may be, the more information that you can give it based on the configuration that you're making makes it so much easier for people to come and adopt that solution and understand that. The user doesn't see the policy, of course. It's only the admins that see that. So I think employee records here, and then I don't have an employee records. Yeah, I play around with these all the time, so forgive me. But yeah, always on the policy. The same with the DLP policy and the DLP rules as well. So if you have a data loss prevention policy, name it that it's a policy. And then you can have multiple rules inside of the policy itself, of course. So you'd always want to name it Rule 1 with a naming convention, Rule 2 with a naming convention, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Okay. Records management. So records management is pretty much the same as information governance, but it's more tuned towards regulatory environments. Okay. So within records management, we get an overview of any pending dispositions that we have or that we built out in the specific policies. We also have file plan. So file plan here gives you that outlook of what retention labeling policies that you build out within records management. So you can have a clear indication of what is inside of your environment. Now, most of the regulated environments that I deal with have to use these because of these functions here within the actual records management templates themselves. So more importantly, if you have a company that has a large retention schedule, you can actually upload them here with the import. And what that will do, if it's in the format that you've got, you can download, you can actually publish all of your data into the template that Microsoft gives you. You can then upload it into here and it will start to build out those policies and labels for you. Okay, let's take a look at this one. So within here then, excuse me, this has a different look and feel to what it does from an information governance perspective, because you would always want to mark out as much detail within inside of the label itself to understand what that actual item is for, if it maps back to any internal policies or if it maps back to any regulatory items itself. You can add in the reference, the business function, categories, subcategories, authority type, and also provision and citation itself. Then on top of that, you get the same look and feel as you did in the information governance. However, you have additional configurations in here, okay? So within this one, you can see everything's the same up to these two items here. So we have mark item as a record and mark item as a regulatory record. Now, mark an item as a record still gives you the ability, once it's been marked with that label, to interact with the document. So you can unlock and lock the actual document itself. So you can go into it, you can upversion it, and so on and so forth, okay? These two, given the fact that I work specifically with financial organizations, I see this being used a hell of a lot. More so the regulatory record here. So in Microsoft terminology, the regulatory record would mean immutability, okay? So if you have an item that you have to mark as an immutable item, you would have to come in here and mark it as a regulatory record. Now, bear in mind, if you go into records management at the moment and try and find this, it will not be there. This is not configured by default. You have to go into PowerShell and configure this. Now, Microsoft have done this specifically for businesses' safety, okay? So if you apply this regulatory record to an item, you can't undo it, okay? You can't undo it. More to the point, there's an additional configuration that you must apply, which is called preservation lock. Now, preservation lock will actually lock the policy down as well. So if you're dealing with customers that say, I must be able to mark an item as immutable, enabling the regulatory record and applying the regulatory record is not enough. You need to also do the same when it comes to preservation lock. Again, beneath here, you have pretty much the same configurations with the disposition review. And then in this scenario, I have other disposition reviewers within it. And I'll just show you one last thing. And then onto the label policies then from a records management perspective. As you can see here now, I have on this side the ability of enabling preservation lock. Now, as I just alluded to, preservation lock will actually lock this policy, okay? So a user can't come in here and move any locations or move any people from within it. You can add to it, but you can never take away, okay? Preservation lock cannot be applied within the actual configuration of the portal. Again, that has to be applied by PowerShell, okay? This is not known. It's not very widely used outside of financial services. I think probably a couple of law firms that I've dealt with have a very similar regulation. Again, we've been through adaptive scope policies and policy lookups. Event-based retention, okay? So I see this being used a lot for project-based retention or even employee termination. And what you can do is you can set up that event-based retention to look for specific criteria or specific keywords. So as you can see here, if I was to email Project Falcon contract, oops, sorry, let me move that the way, or any of these matters here, okay, when the information governance engine detects those, okay, it will actually start to apply the retention that you've configured in the background, okay? So it's kind of an automated way of doing it. I see this being used more frequently when it comes to employee termination. Let me load this one up and I'll show you this one. So if somebody types in the subject of the email, subject termination, okay, then what happens is it kicks off the retention-based period straight away. And you can have any time-based retention period into that. This works well for large organizations that don't have a very good joiners, movers, and leavers, or they have many projects going on, and they're just unable to basically keep a hold of them and manage them from a governance perspective. You can also add this to SharePoint sites and OneDrive sites. Now, with this asset ID here, this is what you would build out on the actual site itself, okay? So if you're actually plugging or uploading data into SharePoint, and that SharePoint site has this asset, and any of these terminologies here are wrapped into the documentation itself, it also applies the actual retention-based period onto that also. So you have that governance configuration covered from an event-based perspective as well. Lastly, you have the disposition, of which I've been through a few times. So within under records management, you have the ability to go through all of the labels that you've had or all the policies that you've had and select them and go into them and find out what disposition is waiting for. You just click on the option and it brings up the items within, okay? In large environments, of course, you would have dedicated teams that work through disposition. They can come in here and open up those items and look through all of the policies that have pending dispositions attached to them. Okay, I'm just a bit cautious of time. It's 8:30. Is there anything else that anybody wants me to go through quickly? Or any questions? No? Okay. Should we just take one? Does everybody have time just to have a look at data loss prevention? Okay, cool. So DLP then. So DLP is made up of 3 flavors. You have Office 365 DLP, which is in here. Then you have EndPoint DLP, and then you have Communications DLP, which is Microsoft's terminology for Teams DLP. Excuse me. Now, when I'm working with anybody that's building out sensitivity labels, I will always tell them to come into data loss prevention and build a DLP policy to block any labels that have an internal reference on them from leaving the environment. So let me show you this policy quickly. Then I'll show you the Teams one. I think these are the 2 biggest ones that I work with. So as you can see here in the description, this applies to the Office 365 locations of Exchange, Online, SharePoint, and OneDrive for Business. And then we obviously have those workloads configured. And then within the rule set itself, I've selected the conditions here of sensitivity labels, sorry. And what I've done is, based on my classification or labeling taxonomy, because those 2 items of labeled as internal, we know within that classification taxonomy that data should not go outside. Therefore, I've chosen another condition to say when content is shared from Microsoft 365 and is outside of my organization, not inside, which is the default configuration, you will have to swap it around, then take the action of restrict access, or encrypt content. Now, when I select block only people outside of your organization, what that does is it looks at the domains that you have configured inside of your Office 365. Okay, so if you have your vanity domain and another load of domains, it looks at those domains. If you are not within those domains, it classes you as outside. What it will do is as soon as you try to send that message, you will get blocked. It will send you a notification if you have the notification switched on here, and it will give you the information within the policy tips you had, should you have it configured, to say, hey, this has been labeled internally, therefore you cannot share this externally. This also works for other labels, of course. They don't have to be labeled with sensitivity internal. It works with any of them. Then you have the incident report, okay? So the incident report, the first toggle here is the email that is sent to the admin. So it's just a general email to say, hey, this policy has just been exfiltrated, XYZ has just happened, here's the information. Now, the good part about this is the incident report. Now, the incident report itself gives you the item. So if I have tried to share a Word document outside of the environment, and that Word document has the confidential internal applied to it, then this will send me the incident report. But bear in mind, okay, the information that you get in here is great, but if this is going to just a standard SOC or a standard bunch of compliance admins or login monitoring admins, then these last two here, I will always advise my customers to take a good look at them, because you actually get within the incident report the document, okay? And you can click on that document and open that document up. Now, if that document is not for your eyes as an admin or a compliance admin, you're going to see sensitive information. So even though I really like this, these two options here, you must take into consideration if you're building this particular rule out, okay? So that's a DLP rule to protect sensitivity labels from being shared externally that I've classed as internal, okay? When you come through to actually turning on the policy, do bear in mind, if it's in test mode with policy tips, the block action will not take place. You will only get a policy match in the DLP reports. You will not get an incident, okay? The policy has to be turned on for any actions and conditions to take place. A lot of companies or a lot of customers that I deal with, they'll switch on, test it out, and they'll ring up saying, it's not blocking anything, Ryan. I said, yes, it's Microsoft to design that so you can get used to it, so you can fine tune that policy. Now, lastly, I'll go through the Microsoft Teams DLP because I see a massive uptake of this at the moment. Excuse me. So again, standard configuration at the top end. Now, when it comes to Microsoft Teams, a lot of people just enable this, okay? This does not cover you for Microsoft Teams. It only covers for you for the chats of the items that, sorry, the actual context of the text that's in the chats. If somebody takes an item from OneDrive and shares it into the Teams chats and channel messages, it is not blocked if you do not have this switched on. The same goes for SharePoint sites. You must have all three of them switched on to give yourself that defense in depth when it comes to the file that's being shared, rather than copy and pasting the item out into text, then into the chat itself. Now, I have two rules here. Ignore the bottom one. I was testing this out for a customer, but the main one I see here is external DLP rule set. So I know that the sensitive information inside of my environment, which I do not want to be shared externally. Now, the external Teams DLP only works if you have a guest user or an external user in that Teams chat or Teams channel. If it is purely internal, it will not block it. That's why I have another one below for a different customer. But let me show you the external one, because that's the biggest one I see it being adopted. So I have, and it varies in completely different in every organization. For an example, I just have sensitive information types here that I would want to be blocked. Okay, so if I'm sharing company credit card information in a Teams chat and there's a guest user or an external user in that chat, it will be blocked. You have the same configuration as the label. So you have a condition that says, here are my sensitive information types. You'll see in here, sensitivity labels are not available. Currently to date, if you have Teams switched on, you can't protect the sensitivity label within the DLP. Then you have a second condition rather, and that condition again is for people outside of my organization. Then you have the actions, and it's exactly the same as the sensitivity label one, where you block only people outside of your organization. The same applies when it comes to the user notification, the user admin alert, sorry, the admin alert, and then the incident report itself. So if I was to go into the company documentation and I was to pull out some company credit card information, copy and paste that into the Teams chat, guest external user in there, it's blocked. It comes up, it shows you as the user who's sent the data in that this is blocked due to your organizational policy. Okay. If I then take that document and try to share the document rather than copy and pasting the information, because I have SharePoint and OneDrive selected, again, it will block. Okay. I have a couple of videos on my YouTube channel around DLP and blocking DLP for sensitivity labels and Teams. Okay. So if you're interested in that, go and take a look. There's an actual walkthrough guide on there and how to set them up and so on and so forth. Okay. And that's DLP. Again, I know it's very quickly, but there's a lot to go through. Is any questions on DLP?
I do have a question, actually. There's some overlap between what you could do with sensitivity labels and DLP, isn't it? I was just trying to, I suppose the advantage of DLP is it will educate people as to why something is blocked, whereas sensitivity labels would just stop it happening, wouldn't it?
That's right, Dylan. Yeah. So a lot of customers will ask, why do I need DLP around if I have sensitivity labels?
Yeah, that's basically my question.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a fair question. And, you know, I get asked that a lot. And I always say, don't forget, with sensitivity labels, you're actually protecting the item at rest. Okay. Now, even though that when you protect that item, once it's protected forever because it travels with the metadata. DLP is a transactional prevention. Okay. So the item must be in transit. Okay. So we've labeled the item with confidential internal. Okay. But somebody's shared that outside. Right. Now, albeit it's encrypted and it's gone outside, but you would always want to have that defense in depth when it comes to the items in your environment, especially around Teams. Okay. I see a massive uptake of DLP for Teams. So let's take Teams for an example. You have a document that's labeled with confidential internal. So you've protected the document, but as a user, I can go into that if I have access to that label. Okay. And I can copy and paste that data out. I can then exfiltrate the data at the brick level and paste that into Teams. Now, if it knows it's come from that document and that sensitive information type is wrapped into that Teams DLP policy, again, you've prevented that data from being shared externally. Hopefully that makes sense, Dylan. You're on mute.
Yeah, that does make sense to me actually now, because I was always struck by the overlap between the two as to why you choose one over the other. Yeah,
and I'll just show you very quickly EndPoint DLP policy, and this will give you a better insight, Dylan, to why DLP is an extension of information protection. So this one is only available for Windows 10 devices and Mac devices currently, which is in preview. Okay, so I want to protect all of this data. All right, so I've taken said document, I've copy and pasted that credit card information out. I've tried to share it in Teams and got blocked. Now what I want to do is I want to copy and paste that information into Notepad++ because I know Notepad++ isn't a Microsoft application. All right. But having done that, if I go into EndPoint DLP and I build out restricted apps, which is access to apps, and I block, okay, within the restricted access for the apps, I can add in Notepad++, Dropbox, Box, G Suite, whatever you want, okay? And then you can come into this DLP policy and say, okay, I'm going to allow them to use Notepad++ to build out PowerShell commands and so on and so forth. But because you're now trying to copy and paste the credit card information of which you just tried to share in Teams into here, this policy is going to block you from doing that also, okay? So hopefully you can see you have that, that defense in depth there when it comes to DLP. Rather than just having the sensitivity label applied to the document, you now have that transactional event when it comes to the data itself.
And in terms of licensing, because this has been applied by a service, I'm guessing that the licensing is for the user's data that's concerned in the same way.
For endpoint DLP, yes, you're right. It's based on the actual user/machine. So everybody must have it to gain benefit of it. So if you have an E3 user that is wrapped into an endpoint DLP policy, they will still be blocked, okay? But you will get a warning to say said user is blocked but not audited, okay? Microsoft are trying to change that at the moment. So if you have an E3 license and you're in an E5 endpoint DLP policy, your machine will not even be onboarded onto the compliance center. There's a lot of confusion around licensing and DLP.
Yeah.
Very much so, very much so. But that's endpoint DLP quickly, and that's just the endpoint policy itself. There's other conditions and other configurations that you can use for endpoint DLP. There's some user overrides here as well. So if you want to, let's say I've got print here on audit. Let's say I had print on block, but I wanted to put an override on it. Then I could come in here and apply that override to it. So a user can say, well, I need to print this, Ryan, because I'm a legal representation and I need to print it off and sign it. You can add that override in, but the user has to put a business justification in. So they say, I need to do this, and here's why I need to do it. Okay, so you have that ability to allow those exceptions should you wish to do so. The other DLP, the other endpoint DLP configuration is under endpoint DLP here. So here are the unallowed apps I was talking about, Dylan. So you can add these in here from an XE perspective, okay? So if you know that there's an application that people use and you have a fear of that they're going to copy and paste data out into that particular application, you can add it into here and then add in the DLP policy below to prevent that from happening. You can also do that from a browser perspective as well. So in here, if you have, not Bluetooth, Ryan. Where's my browser?
One down.
Yep, there we go. Thank you. So we can come into here and say, well, I know I have no control over Firefox, okay? Because Firefox is not covered from a Microsoft endpoint DLP perspective. So you can block that browser from using, you block the user from using that browser when it comes to sensitive information. If I wanted to go on to, I don't know, bbc.co.uk with Firefox, I can do that. It doesn't stop you from using the browser or the app. It just stops you from interacting with sensitive information or documents that have been labeled with a sensitivity label. Okay, so it's protecting your data. So it prevents the user from that aspect as well. And then you've got service domains down here as well. So you can either go through a block list or an allow list. So you can block specific domains. So if I try to upload a document that's been labeled with a sensitivity label to google.com, or I try to copy and paste information from a sensitive information type to one of these items here, like in a text file or something, that will also block me. I know that's a very, very, very quick overview of endpoint DLP, but any questions from anybody? No? Good. Okay. Well, I hope that was a benefit to all of you. Hope you enjoyed that.
I mean, there's an awful lot here, isn't there, Ryan? So, you know, so well done on getting through all this lot. I wonder how much some of us have managed to absorb and retain in this run through. I'm in the process of playing with some of these things right now off the back of your talk with one of my businesses. So so I might have to come back and ask you when I screw up. But yeah, it's a lot more powerful than I realised, which doesn't come as a shock to me, but it is intimidating. Again, my concern is, Yeah, is there anything that looks like a quick start for an SME, a small business that doesn't have expertise in depth and just needs to try and stand up a minimum set of protections around their stuff? And again, by the kind of people who run SMEs, which are people who are probably not any kind of expert, they're just entrepreneurs.
Oh, that's a very difficult question to answer, yeah.
I mean, the real question is, where would we find a guide, sort of compliance 101 that says, if you've started a new business or you've taken over a business, these are the things you need to check and make sure that you've got at least this stuff covered.
I would probably say, come into Compliance Manager, because Compliance Manager will give you that oversight on what configurations you would have to make within your environment. Plus, it would give you the improvement actions that we've got here, Simon. And you can see when you have the improvement actions here, you can go through each of the items, all right? And then you can select the improvement action, and then you can start to build out your environment. But there's obviously going to be things in there that it doesn't know about that particular environment itself. So you may be in a law firm or a medical company or something like that. My overall approach is come into Compliance Manager, understand what configuration you can do first and foremost, just to get you into a decent configuration. Then come into information protection, okay, and just build out 4 basic labels if you have to. If it's just going to be a quick fix thing, build out 4 labels, and that labels will be general, confidential recipients only, confidential internal, and maybe a highly confidential internal. Okay, that then would give you that coverage from a compliance perspective when it comes to your labeling taxonomy. Now, it's not going to fit every single environment, right? But it's going to be a quick win. Then you can add to those labels as you find more sensitive data, or when you build out a specific labeling taxonomy for said company under said regulation, And then the next thing I would go for is information governance, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to retain that data. All right. And if you're going through an acquisition and a merger and you've just bought another business, my first and foremost thing would be to actually go into advanced e-discovery, okay, create a case, add all of your users in, and put preservation hold on. That way, nobody's going to be able to delete anything out of that environment. So if there's any topical data or any sensitive information in there, or any intellectual property that is relevant to your acquisition or merger, nobody can delete anything. You've captured all of that data. You put a full stop to anybody deleting anything. Okay, then that gives you the understanding of that data. Then you can start to work through that data from a governance perspective and understand, okay, data from this department needs this retention. Data from this department doesn't need a retention. Data from this department does need a retention, but it also needs a disposition review. Okay, I know that's a long-winded answer, but there's no real quick fix.
Yeah,
It's just purely dependent on the first things I ask is, are you regulated? Yes, I'm regulated. What is your regulator? And then I'll come into the Compliance Manager and show them all the configurations that are under it. I'm not too sure if he was on the session when I was going through the assessments here from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I always say, Compliance Manager, your best friend. If you can come in here and click on the data protection baseline, which is free, which you get with E3, okay, you can come through here and have a look at those improvement actions and start to build out your environment, your customer's environment, whomever it may be, to give you some confidence that you're closing in on your compliance requirements, okay? And here they all are. You just basically go through these, pick out any one that you want, look at the configuration, look at the improvement action and the notes in the background, and head off and configure it in your environment. But I wouldn't get too held up, as I said, on the compliance score. The amount of people that I speak to that says, oh, I'm trying to get my compliance score up to 100. Like, if you get it to 100, you're going to lock yourself out of everything. It's crazy that the amount of people that go into analysis paralysis with this. But I think the overview page itself, Simon, it gives you enough information, you know, especially under the proven actions here, just to have a quick look and understand, oh, well, yeah, enable self-service password reset, you know, good shout, Microsoft. I'll go and do that now. And not only are you building out your compliance score, you're actually building out your security posture as well by doing these items inside of here, because a lot of these will not just be specific to compliance. There'll be actually security, compliance, and identity improvement actions. So you get that knock-on effect with that configuration as you walk through them. And then again, on the other side, you have view all the solutions, and then you can pick a specific solution out, like information governance, and then you can have a look at how many remaining items that you need to cover off, okay? And from in here as well, you can just select open it, and it will just open the information governance for you. I really like Compliance Manager, and a lot of people think it's just too messy, but I actually really like it. I think it gives you a very, very detailed, it gives you the gap analysis that you're looking for, essentially. You know what I mean? Instead of having to build out that gap analysis between you and your customer, you can just come in here and have it built out for you, and the configuration guides with it. So this is just an example of the information governance one. Choosing any of these and following the improvement actions, I just think it's phenomenal what Microsoft have given you here. It really, really does help. I've had some major companies come to me and be like, great, we never even thought about looking at Compliance Manager because we just thought it was just all noise around compliance and regulations, and it's not. There's actually specific configurations in that you can go through.
Yeah, there's just a lot of it. So
Yes.
just a gut feel. If, yeah, again, if it was a company that hasn't done any of this stuff properly, which is almost every company I know, how long do they need? How much effort do they need to throw at getting a basic level? You know, what Simon Doyle and I would call a level 300 in the maturity model, a basic level of compliance in place just to cover their asses, because every business in the UK is a regulated business, GDPR being only the start of it.
Yes, absolutely. I would say maximum effort, I guess 3 to 5 days, you could have a very, very basic but enough configuration in your environment to cover you for whatever scenario.
And how much of that 3 to 5 days of configuration would be guided by the improvement actions, etc., in Compliance Manager, or they would have to realise that they did because it isn't covered there? I guess my question really is, where is the Compliance 101 guide to help UK businesses get their asses covered with this tool?
Then I would say the data protection baseline, which is covered from a Compliance Manager. I would come in here, I would click on the data protection baseline, which is free. It's given to you as part of your E3 licensing. Get in there, have a look at the improvement actions in there, and that, as it states, gives you that data protection baseline. That is your 101, essentially, Simon. Okay.
Right, I'm going to go through that, and then I'll get back to you if I say, well, where's this bit then? But yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you come into Compliance Manager.
Yep, I'm right there now.
And then if you go to assessments.
Yep.
You should see data protection baseline as the only one in there. Okay. When you select on that, go into your improvement actions. All of those improvement actions, okay, pick out the ones that are relevant to, I would say, sensitivity labeling, DLP, information governance. Take a look at those improvement actions within them.
Yep.
Okay. Doesn't have to be doesn't have to be auto apply. It can just be apply labels to documents and emails. Okay, as this one states here. Pick up the basic ones and just follow that information improvement action itself. That will give you, as I say, that data protection baseline. That covers you for day dot.
Okay, it's interesting that I don't see that particular action in my list, but anyway, that's by the by.
Okay. So I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. Oh, it's under record management. It's under record.
Yeah, I have apply sensitivity labels, but I don't have apply records.
Yeah, so it's under record management. So it will know that I've got E5 configured.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's only turned on those things which I have licensed.
Yes. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, okay.
I think compliance, as I say, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think Compliance Manager gives you a hell of a lot of information. And if you want that day one configuration, even if you want that heavily regulated configuration, Compliance Manager is your best friend. It's not going to do it for you, but it's going to give you that roadmap of, hey, you need to do this, and this is how you would do it. And here is where you would go to do it. And then you just need to do it. It's as simple as that. It's very, very good. I love Compliance Manager.
I mean, just in that data protection baseline, I mean, there must be, I don't remember what it is, 80 or something different items.
There's 609 actions in there.
280 items on mine. There you go. Actually says it at the top because I don't have an E5.
Right. Okay.
So 280 items. So again, this is not a criticism. It's really just me thinking on my feet here.
No, it's fine.
That's an awful lot of stuff for a small business, even a big business manager, to try and get their head around, to make active decisions on which things should they be, turning on and getting right, and learning about, and which can they get away with leaving. I'd love to see a 101 guide. That says when you go into data protection baseline of the 280 improvement actions, you should really be paying attention to these 17 things.
Yeah, and I think this is why a lot of businesses out there look at compliance and think, wow, this is just too much for us to take on board, and like I said, I even have large financial services out there that I've basically given the inclination to come and use Compliance Manager, and clever people that I've worked in compliance for a long time, good technical people that I've worked for a long time, and they've just gone, so I need to go through all of these? It's like, well, yeah. And like, Microsoft is saying this is a guidance, okay? This is guidance for you. You can go through this and make out these configurations yourself. If we could automate all of this configuration with one button, great. But it's just not possible for us to do. And I think that's what scares a lot of people away. They look at this and think, wow, that is a lot of things to do, and run off.
Yeah, I mean, again, great consulting opportunity for those people in this section.
Yes, absolutely, and that's kept me in a job. So
Yeah.
I saw Nikki had her hand up a moment ago, but put it back down. Did you want to ask a question, Nikki?
Well, it's more of an observation, really. So I've just been touched base with Simon before on building out the Microsoft maturity model. So I've proposed a compliance sort of maturity model. And I think what is important for an organisation is not to focus on the how, which you've been looking at, is the what. So when I go in, is finding out where they are. So it's getting that baseline and that compliance. Are they a 100, or in a lot of cases, I think they're below 100. If you could have a 0, I think they'd be below that. And find out where they want to go. Not everybody wants to get up to that level 500. So it's putting in those kind of baby steps, finding out what keeps them awake at night. Is it, I've done a whole thing. For me, the number one thing is if you've got guests enabled in your tenant, then that's binary, that's on or off. Therefore, people could be sharing any content from your tenant with anyone else. So for me, that's where I focus on. So I look at those business scenarios and then I go and cherry pick what I want to put in, because even though you can look at the compliance manager and start at those high scores, that might not have the biggest bang for the buck per se. So it's got to be business driven, technology second.
Yeah. So every engagement that I get, my initial stage of that engagement is that pre-configuration assessment. Okay. So it's understanding that data landscape that company has and understanding those priorities. So the first 2 sessions would be, okay, where are you now? Let's do that pre-assessment. Okay, look at the configurations that you have. And then I'll get the relevant people with the right roles and responsibilities onto the second call. And then we'll go through, okay, here is where you are now. This is the gap analysis that you need to map over onto, whether that's into a regulation, Nikki, or whether that's into internal, preferences. And then we say, what are your priorities? Okay. So if you have labels built out, but you've not got labels out for recipient only, or you have information governance built out, but you don't have disposition reviews because you don't have records management, whatever the case may be, it would be mapping out those priorities. And only till we have them do we go back and give configurations. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Figure out that journey, if you like.
Yeah, and I think also some of these things are almost too advanced. So for me, it's trying to block down the big thing, put those retention policies in, put those container labels in, start small there, then start looking at that. So, I mean, I've recently done some blogs on it, so, and it's kind of, Microsoft 365 and Teams governance is not a project, it's a lifestyle.
Yeah.
So it's not something that you do once, and that crawl, walk, run approach is really important, but it has to be that cultural mindset change. Like you're going through any change, people want to do it. Otherwise you'll go in, set all these like really cool things up, put all the labels in, you walk away as a consultant, and then it just goes back to chaos again. Yeah.
And I think a prime example of that is sensitivity labeling. As soon as you get a customer interested in sensitivity labeling, you get the technical guys, you get the compliance team, the legal team going, this is great. This is exactly what we want to do. But the adoption of that from a user perspective is very, very scary. And the user end training that has to go into it, if they've never used labeling before, and they now start to see the Azure Information Protection Unified Labeling client popping up saying, you need to apply a label to this or a recommendation coming up to this, they just go, push the keyboard away and go straight to support and say, my computer's acting crazy. It's asking me to do all this weird stuff because they've never seen it before. So you're absolutely right. And especially when it comes to even information governance, applying a label to an item to keep it for a certain amount of time, it's that journey in itself, like you say, is a complete change of culture when it comes to IT, because the end user doesn't care about compliance, right? But if you're giving them compliance actions to do, now they're a part of your compliance. So they need to understand why it is they're doing it. So you'll get companies that say, I want 10 labels, Ryan. I want 10 sensitivity labels. And it's like, well, people are going to have to go through 10 labels and justify why they've selected a certain label. Whether that's the right label or not, they don't know.
They pick the top one.
That's a prime example, right? And I have most customers that say, I'll just turn on mandatory labeling, Ryan. So yeah, but that's the only label you have throughout your environment. Whether or not that data is secret, you'll just have the general label for 10,000 documents, It's not the way to go. So I'm completely with you. The hardest part of compliance is actually adopting the solutions. Building them out is easy. That's the fun part. But giving it to a user to adopt, wow, that's where your 6-10 months comes into, just doing that user adoption. Microsoft does have some user training material, but it's out of date quite a lot. They are working on it at the moment. So if you keep an eye out for those, I think they're going to be released mid-February, the end of February, and there's going to be a whole new bunch of user training on sensitivity labels, information governance labels, even communications compliance, how to use it, how to use business etiquette, and so on and so forth. But again, it's only materials for you to read. Adopting the solution is a very different argument, very different story. So you're absolutely right.
I often find if I just focus on those crown jewels, that important stuff with a subset of an organisation, they've got to find out what's in it for me. So people have to have that business driver to do anything. So even if it's a case of, well, it's only kind of the top 10% of my content, if I can protect that, that's probably 95% of your risk of your company. And then you just say, well, it's just too hard to get there. So, you have to treat data differently.
Absolutely. And that's why I said to Simon just then, pick 4 sensitivity labels, pick a general, which can go out to anybody, pick a public, pick a highly confidential, and just apply 2 sub-labels to it, internal and recipient only. That's going to cover you for 99.9% of your scenarios. If you do then have highly confidential or a secret, You can build that out after the fact, okay? Because most of the users that deal with that very sensitive information don't even have access to it. It's segmented to the top board, you know, those types of really high CEO, CX level people. So you can actually segment that a little bit. And those are the ones that are more trustable when it comes to that type of documentation anyway. It's your other audience, it's your other end users that aren't. So you're absolutely right.
I'm absolutely with Nikki with the crown jewels argument of like, so what legally in your company do you have to look after? Your contracts, you have to keep them for 10 years. Let's label them. Is it your HR things you have to delete after 12 months? Label them.
Priorities.
Let's actually get this stuff so the platform's supporting you. And you can just like take a breather and go, I don't have to panic about that every day. And that's what it's about. This is what you're doing. You're trying to sell them on what you want to do is allow people to sleep well at night.
Exactly, yeah. So you pick out those priorities. You know, I have customers that come to me that have maybe a single label, or they have an amazing classification, labeling, taxonomy document, right? Or even an amazing retention schedule. And they're like, hey, look what we've done, Ryan. It's like, yeah, now you've got to get that into a configuration, all right? But because you have maybe 3 months worth of work, what are your priorities? What are your regulations? Oh, well, I'm under Sec 17A, so we'll work on that first, right? That's it. That's exactly the best way to go, Ruth. Well, I'm glad people enjoyed that. It's been a good conversation.
Yeah, I got another question. It might be a bit abstract. I'm a big fan of scripted environments. So you'd have a dev environment and a live environment and being able to test things. Does obviously a lot of stuff in SharePoint works very, very readily in that, and we've worked hard to build pipelines in Azure DevOps. Does this stuff script up well, or do you know if people are trying this, or are we pushing it beyond the edge of where people are at the moment?
So I'll certainly say it scripts well enough. And I don't want to sound fickle-minded by saying that. It's just that there are some actual components in the rules and features that don't take well to actual PowerShell. Now, I know advanced e-discovery is probably a good one to choose here. Up until recently, Dylan, there was very limited controls around PowerShell within advanced e-discovery. When it comes to labeling, though, you can pretty much do whatever you want within label when it comes to PowerShell. In fact, most of the customizations that you do to labeling is done via PowerShell. And then you've got information governance and records management. You can build out labels, build out policies, build out adaptive scope policies and those queries via PowerShell. And the same with records management when it comes to regulatory items and so on and so forth. Predominantly support PowerShell. But there are some of them that don't. And DLP, what I found with DLP, creating a standard policy works fine. But when you get into the complexity of the rule, the PowerShell command would be quite large because there's a lot of options in there for you to go through. I would always go back into the portal and build the rule out. Okay. But if you've got a good script kiddie or you've got a good DevOps environment, sure, you would probably get through 75%, 80% of the solutions to do that. Insider risk management has very minimal PowerShell compliance. Comms compliance has very limited PowerShell. But for the main solutions, for the day-to-day solutions, I would say yes.
Yeah. Because obviously that's good because you can let people test in a sandbox environment and they can't break anything.
Correct. But I would always tell customers to test this out. You know, I have, long story back, I won't give the name away, but they enabled auto-labeling and they run the scan once. They didn't check the items and just turned it on. And they went and labeled almost 350,000 items in their environment. So they had to build out a SharePoint site, migrate all of these items into it and use the AIP super user, which is essentially what you would do to decrypt the items. And it took I think 10, 11 days just to do the de-encryption of all the items. Now, once it was all de-encrypted, they had to put them back into the place where they originally were. And it took about 4 or 5 weeks to get from the encrypt to the de-encrypt. So I'd always say, whenever you're testing these out, however simple they may seem, they will completely trip you up if you're not watching what you're doing.
But there's test this policy thing, isn't there, for data
Yeah.
loss prevention and things like that. How much of the test this policy stuff is there for compliance labeling?
Well, none at all, as you've probably noticed, right, Ruth? And I think on the auto labeling, given the fact that Microsoft don't give you that on button straight away, it's a get out of jail clause for them to say, well, you should have checked that items before you turned it on, you know? So when it comes to information protection, obviously you have the policies and you can narrow those down to pilot groups should you wish to do so, to test those out. And again, with information governance and records management, you can narrow them down into the policy to pilot groups, let's call them for a better term. But with the auto labeling side of it, like I say, my customer just went blip and pressed the button, not realizing, and it went out and basically pretty much all of their environment. Yeah, pretty much all of their environment just got labeled with a random label, and they came in the next day and like, nobody can access this, Ryan. It's like, oh, okay, you've selected on the auto labeling. That's probably why. So you can narrow it down if you wish to do so. It's not a test mode per se, if I understand what you're saying, but you have the ability to narrow it down in the policies.
Having a specific SharePoint prototype site that you apply it to first is probably a good plan, isn't it?
Yeah, well, as soon as I get engaged, I will say to customers, I give them a document, okay? When within that document, there is a creation of a 365 group, and in that group would be particular users. And then there's the creation of a SharePoint site, because I want to use that site for testing the auto labeling, the DLP, the retention, whatever the case may be, even wrapping insider risk management into it. They go away, they create them. That then means I'm not touching production. I'm not touching live data. I'm only touching what I want to touch. So if something does go wrong, the worst I have to do is delete the SharePoint site. That's it. That's the worst we have to do. But if you're doing this with live items, which some companies will do, then you're in a whole world of trouble if something like that happens.
Yeah, that's really useful to have that.
Yeah, for
not
sure.
To do example. Yeah. Thank you.
So I want a test OneDrive for the test users. I always tell them to create OneDrive sites for them, of course, and a couple of SharePoint sites. If I'm testing out, I don't know, exact data match or trainable classifiers, then I'll ask for another 2, you know, and then I'll just get them to copy the data from the locations where the live data is into those locations. And I have a copy of them. So if those items become corrupt because of, I don't know, enabling co-authoring or something's happened with the auto labeling policy in the background, it's corrupted the items, or the trainable classifiers corrupted the items, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Yes, it's a pain to go back through and create them all again, but at least we haven't caused any data loss. Yeah.
Test users, OneDrive, mailboxes, and some test SharePoint sites. Yeah, 100%. That makes a lot of sense.
100%. That's the first things I ask for when we go into pilot mode.
Yeah. Cool.
Fantastic.
Can I ask a very specific weird question? I'm going to post it in the chat anyway, but
sure.
I had somebody ask me about Compliance Manager today, and a solution that I've developed, which is based on SharePoint lists. And the person that's the compliance manager seems to be able to see more than she ought to see in these SharePoint lists in her normal day-to-day being a user role.
Oh, really?
And it shouldn't do that apart from through the compliance manager interface, I thought.
Yeah, because the compliance manager permissions are specifically built out for the compliance manager. I wouldn't expect them to have any SharePoint admin permissions in there because it's not actually pulling anything or pushing anything to SharePoint. So I will take your question away, and I actually have a call with product group every Wednesday, and I'll ask them if there's anything specific in there that they've noticed. I'll actually ask the team that I'm working within as well if there's anything in there that maps over into SharePoint. I can't see it being. The compliance rules are very stringent. We took a lot of time out from, well, I didn't. Product group took a lot of time out to give the least privilege permissions needed. That's why you'll see some compliance roles have many different management group roles within inside of them. But SharePoint from compliance management, ooh, that's an odd one. I'd have to do some investigation on that.
I'm suspecting it's probably just a bug with something they've released recently, but I thought it was all through the optic of using the compliance manager dashboards and cases and all of that sort of stuff to see more data. It shouldn't be through that person's everyday role, because otherwise you need to give them an admin compliance manager account.
The only thing that would spring to mind, yeah,
which I didn't think was the model that was being used.
Not at all, no. So I think the only thing that would spring to mind, if you'd have said to me that you have some visibility onto SharePoint, would be the sensitivity labeling role or the compliance admin role, where you would have the ability to create those labels, of course, and apply those labels to said SharePoint sites. But I wouldn't think it would give you that deeper dive into the actual SharePoint list itself. So you're right, there must be something recently that's released that scrambled one of the permissions outside of Compliance Manager.
Yeah, it's all right. You can take that one away. You don't have to answer it on the fly.
Yeah, I'm just gonna take that down in my notepad now. So just bear with me.
Sorry,
I'll ask that
didn't mean
tomorrow.
to throw that one in, but
no, you're quite right. I think that's interesting.
Completely confuzzled me today.
That's quite all right. It's a good one to ask. Yeah, absolutely. That should not happen.
When it used to be built into SharePoint on premises, I could see extra things if I did check users' permissions, but now you can't because it's in Office 365. It's a step away, so it doesn't show up even in a weird thing on check user permissions like it used to do. So
yeah, like I said, those permissions in cloud are built out with very stringent permissions. So, but look, I'll certainly ask tomorrow. Maybe someone in the team has heard of it. Maybe they're not aware of it, but we can certainly go and test it out. But thanks for letting us know.
Thank you.
You're welcome anytime. All right. Is there anything else from anybody else? Can I help anybody else with any other questions, perhaps? I'll take that as a no. Silence is golden.
Well, I guess if that's the case, no other hands have gone up or no one's shouting out. I think I want to personally thank Ryan for coming along and giving us such a detailed, in-depth, and frankly exhausting review of Compliance Centre. It's been on my list of things to get a better understanding of for a long time. So, you know, my personal thanks for that. And yeah, exactly. Clap, clap. Yeah, if other questions do come up, you know, feed them through to Dylan, Simon, and Ryan. We'll try and get them over to Ryan. We'll try and make the video recording and transcript of this whole session available. God knows I need to go run through some of it again to see if I can make some of this work. Yeah, I guess just to remind everybody that our current intention is not to have a typical user group session next month because it's December and we're almost at Christmas, and therefore by convention instead we'll let you know a night when we're likely to all disappear off to commonly Leeds, could be York, and have some drinks together in a less formal setting. So anybody that wants to come along to that and help us celebrate the end of the year, then please come along. Have I forgotten anything, guys? Because I've had a bit of a rushing around like a blue-ass Friday today.
No, I think you got it all. I guess we talk about the next session, which is in a pub without any talk of Microsoft 365. And then I guess beyond that, we talk about our plans for January.
Yes, 18th, isn't it? 18th of January will be our next one.
Right. Have we got a tentative date for drinking?
Probably, would it be the 21st of December? The Tuesday?
Well, after the next P&P session. That could work.
No, we're not doing it, are we? We're not doing the P&P.
Oh no, that was bounce, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, 21st sounds like a good target date. So put it in your diary as tentative for those of you who want to participate.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ryan. That was really, really interesting.
Yeah, a lot
It's
to take
ridiculous
on.
how many settings there are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is a lot. I said that in the email. It's like there's a lot to go through, so I'll go through as quick as I can. I know I'm probably an hour and a half over, so that just shows
Okay. We
how
do
much
this
is
all
in
the
there,
time.
you know. But here, if there's any particular solution under the Compliance Center you want to deeper dive into, I know we didn't touch well on endpoint DLP or Teams DLP. I can give you some demos on that and how it works and show you what it's like from an endpoint perspective as well. You know, when items are blocked within Teams or within the endpoint DLP itself. Anything that you want to go through in more detail, give me a shout. I'm more than happy to help out. I appreciate the opportunity to come and do this tonight. So thank you in your return.
Really good. Yeah, like on that, just sort of subjects, if there are things which people want to hear. So if one of those is, and Ryan has got the energy to do the session at some point and start 2022, that'd be fantastic. I'd take it up on that opportunity, Ryan. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Anytime. Just get in touch with me. More than happy to help. And I'll certainly ask the question for you tomorrow, Ruth.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'll leave you to it. I do need to go and rest now. I'm quite exhausted, so
Yeah,
I'd have
think
a
I need
coffee
to lie down
so
after
late,
that.
you know. But again, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for sticking around, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.
Yeah, great job. Thanks again,
Thank you very
Ryan.
much.
Cheers. Thanks.
You're
Cheers,
welcome.
Ryan.
Cheers, everybody. See you later.
Bye, everyone. I need to go and have a lay down now.
Me
Or
too.
play with Compliance
Who is
Center.
going to European Collaboration Summit end of November, December? Is anybody?
They've all gone. I am. Well, I am if you tell me what the
We are.
tickets
We
are.
are. Well,
Are you talking, Edit?
No. We did submit, didn't we, ages
We
ago?
did. We need to try and do that Scottish one as well.
Yes.
Scottish Summit's closed, I think, the submission deadline on that one.
Oh yeah, no, it was in. Do you know it was the end of October, wasn't it?
Yeah. I remember sneaking one in and literally the last day.
I remember who's talking in January. It's on Viva. We were going to do Viva. We're doing Viva Connections, I think.
Yes. Who did we strong arm into doing that?
I'm going to get involved as well. I was going to do one with Sarah from do the dev perspective and then the end user.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Sarah Fenner's your genius for that.
Yeah, that was it. Sarah said, I know something about that, and that was it. She was immediately gaffer taped to a lamppost until she agreed to do it for us.
Yeah, she's a goodie.
Yeah, it'll be